I'm going to attempt this in a bad Swedish accent. It is impossible, according to the press, to be a true American unless you are pro-British. If you are America first, last, for all time, and solely for America, for the masses, then you are classified as pro-German. This is a quotation from the father of Charles Lindbergh, the aviator, who was a congressman during World War I and also an opponent of becoming involved in the war. Though we do not know this for certain, doubtless this sentiment informed Lindbergh's options and opinions in the lead up to World War II. And if anything, this is going to be probably closer to contemporary American notions of the term, of what it is to not just be much of a case for America first, but for America alone.
And you're right, Marshall. That was a terrible Swedish accent.
Hopefully we can get into some of the depths of this. But it is important to kind of keep in mind that the sort of people in the Midwest are going to play a bigger role in this portion concerning the latest incarnation of America First.
Welcome to the United States of Amnesia. You found us. Thank you. We are the podcast that reminds us of what we have forgotten. It is often said that history repeats itself. Mark Twain allegedly said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Ecclesiastes probably said it best in chapter 1, verse 9, quote, "Everything that has been will be again. Everything that has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun," close quote. But over time, many topics have become clouded by biases and oversimplifications, or have become mythologized and now are misunderstood. Misunderstanding means learning the wrong lessons from history, or even learning nothing at all. And that can leave us poorly prepared for history's next rhyme. Your hosts for this podcast are Marshall Newman, Mike Mendenhall, and myself, Blake Henke. In this podcast, we will cover topics of history, politics, and religion, how they interact, and how they relate to modern-day events and themes. We will try to cut through biases, oversimplifications, and myths to learn better lessons from the past and to see what they can tell us about the present and maybe even the future. This third episode will cover America First ideology from 1927 to the mid-1930s. So, to pick up where we left off in the previous episode, Lindbergh had flown the Atlantic from New York City to Paris and become, in the process, the most famous person on the planet. He will later become very influential in the America First movement in the lead up to World War II.
Organizations like the Klan and even the pro-Italian fascist organizations were in the ascension, including the occasion of one Fred Trump being arrested at a riot that broke out in Queens in support of these two movements. Although we take the concept of the melting pot for granted, there were significant pockets of resistance to this notion, particularly in the 1920s. And this wasn't just limited to a region or state, but this was a phenomenon that was nationwide. This was demonstrated fully in 1928 during the election that pitted Herbert Hoover against Al Smith. Even the name such as Smith, which you would think would be very American, there were large portions of the country that did not think he was American enough to be president. Smith was Catholic, which meant that he was unacceptable to large numbers of Protestant voters around the country. He was also opposed to Prohibition, which was supported by numerous nativists as a means of curtailing the unsavory habits of immigrants, many of whom used alcohol as a critical element in community socialization. Smith was also from New York City, the sink of corruption. Smith was a Catholic, which meant he was unacceptable to large numbers of Protestant voters around the country. He was also opposed to Prohibition, which was also supported by numerous nativists as a means of curtailing the unsavory habits of immigrants, many of whom had alcohol as a critical element of community socialization. Smith was also from New York City, that sink of corruption, and a product of working-class immigrant culture who relied on Tammany Hall to survive. His remarks on the radio, as he pronounced it, further alienated him from voters in the South and the Midwest. Herbert Hoover, by contrast, portrayed himself as the only Christian running for president. In this tip of the hat to nativism, Hoover was being consistent with the Republican Party's anti-immigrant, pro-enforcement of Prohibition America First stance as adapted by the Republican Party in the election of 1920, and also the Coolidge administration's attempts to limit the number of immigrants arriving from Asia and Europe, although not from other parts of the Western Hemisphere. So successful was Hoover that he managed to crack the Solid South, winning Virginia, Florida, North Carolina, Kentucky, and Texas in the 1928 election. It's worth noting, to put this into context, that in 1928 there were people living in those states for whom the Civil War was part of living memories. It was little more than 60 years in the past, the same as Vietnam is today. The Republican Party was the party of Lincoln and Reconstruction, and these were not positive takes on the matter. When I was a child, I heard of people summoning younger relatives to the deathbed of Confederate veterans and made to promise never to vote for Republican as a result of long memories regarding the Civil War. For those states to vote Republican and against a Democrat speaks volumes about the prevailing attitudes regarding Catholics, immigrants, and Prohibition. The prevailing nativism annulled any pretense of ancestral loyalty. Hoover's good times in the White House lasted a little more than 8 months when the stock market crash of 1928 ended the Roaring Twenties. The Republican prosperity was not nationwide, and it only deepened long-standing problems in rural America, which had been largely ignored by most politicians in the decade. Hoover's problems deepened by a series of bank failures, which were unaddressed as well. The effects of the Depression were compounded by the introduction of the Smoot-Hawley tariff bill, which ensured the effects of the Great Depression would persist in the United States longer than elsewhere in the world due to the problems created in terms of exports.
And it's interesting to consider Smoot-Hawley in the context of a lot of what we've been talking about regarding America First. We don't want to go down a big rabbit hole on tariffs and international economic history and things like that, but there's a way of thinking in the world that the world economy is a finite pie, right? And you have to get a bigger piece of the pie in order to become wealthier at someone else's expense. In liberal economic theory that came up later, the pie is expandable. So you can grow the pie, and by growing the pie, you can grow everybody's pie slice. You don't have to necessarily take something away at the expense of someone else. So in that context, here comes Smoot-Hawley with their tariffs, and that immediately deepens the Depression. It turned out to be a terrible idea. It actually hurt the economy. The rural areas had, as we talked about previously, had been in a depression of their own since the 20s. You could make an argument that it made some sense to do something to help the farmers by maybe restricting imports of agricultural products, perhaps. But the way they did it was wrong because it actually made the farmers worse off.
It made everybody worse off.
Made everybody worse off, including the farmers. But it's interesting, this quote by Smoot. He died in 1941. But before he died, he wrote his memoirs. And he has a quote where he says that, defending his tariff that he and Hawley imposed, right? He said, "The world is paying for its ruthless destruction of life and property in the World War," meaning World War I, "and for its failure to adjust purchasing power to productive capacity during the Industrial Revolution of the decade following the war. So this fits in with what we talked about previously about America First. If there's an idea in there that the European world, the Europeans, had done their dirty deeds, as they always did, and had dragged us into a terrible war, terribly destructive war. That was their fault. And we were somehow better than that, right? That they had to pay for what they had done during World War I, because we over here in the New World were something better and superior to that. This other thing, too, where he talks about the world had failed to adjust its purchasing power to productive capacity, is gobbledygook I don't fully understand. It sounds to me like he's saying that you shouldn't manufacture more than you can import on your balance of payments in terms of value, right? If you're manufacturing too much and exporting too much, you shouldn't do that. You should somehow balance how much you're paying other people with how much you're taking in, right? The international economy doesn't really work that way. So what is he getting at?
And even mercantilism. This is kind of like, with mercantilism, this is the kind of approach that you take as well in terms of balance of payments and things like that. It does sound like economic gobbledygook.
Yeah, you're making too much money compared to how much you produce. It's kind of what that sounds like, and I don't know what that means. But anyway,
I could think that it might have something to do, because this was an obsession that people had, was over World War I debts that were owed to the United States. And this was like an obsession during the 30s. This was kind of like that, if you want to draw contemporary parallels, it's like Trump going after NATO member states and saying you're not paying your fair share. So this is kind of consistent with that. There is also, as we touched on last time, the notion that protective tariffs were good for American industry, and that this would kind of get us out of the Depression. The problem was, if you look at this from kind of like almost a monetarist position, you're basically trying to get more out of a shrinking pie. And you're not really coming up with a way to grow the pie or to increase profits. And the things that help run your economy, such as banks and other financial institutions, those things are disappearing. So you're actually seeing a tightening of credit, which doesn't really get addressed by putting on higher levels of protection. And this was not necessarily in other countries. Britain came out of the Depression a lot faster than we did. France did as well, because they weren't trying to basically play beggar my neighbor here with extreme tariffs. Tariffs went up on U.S. goods in response to Smoot-Hawley, and therefore we could not increase economically our abilities here. And this is always the thing with tariffs. I'm a huge proponent of free trade, because you get the best results from this. It may not always be happy, but it's like you do get the best end results for the consumer, and you do also have opportunities to be able to export your goods overseas that you otherwise wouldn't have here.
And what I find interesting, and again, in the America First context, is, ironically, this impulse among America Firsters to look at the world in terms of income and outgo, dollars and cents, in a very narrow way, leads to negative effects. It's because they're so focused on putting themselves first, they stop to think of how thinking about someone else's interests could also benefit you in the long run, right? You make money, I make money, we're both wealthier, we can buy things from each other, right? They're so focused on just saying we need to make more money than other people because we come first, that they're missing that broader issue there, and it applies to other things outside of tariffs and economics and everything else. But it's part of the mentality of the movement.
Of the sense of purity that exists over here. It's kind of that approach, their view of America as this pure, unsullied place.
Right.
We don't need nasty foreign goods here. we don't need nasty foreigner. We don't need to work with nasty foreigners who are just going to exercise their corrupting influence upon us. The thing is, tariffs really, in my mind, and I'd love to hear from our listeners about their opinions on this. They work well if you're starting up industry. If you're moving from an agricultural to an industrialized state, sure. It buys you some time to kind of set up your own national industries to be able to be competitive. But at a certain point, you kind of got to take the training wheels off and function in the world economy. And this is kind of what mature industrial economies do when this happens. And coming up with these kind of protectionist regimes, certainly something as broad as Smoot-Hawley, it does not help advance your economy. And again, anybody who's complaining about how expensive the New Deal was, well, guess what, guys? You people who generally supported Smoot-Hawley, opposed the New Deal, you brought this on yourself because you deepened artificially the impact of the Great Depression.
But you see, when you look at Smoot's quote there, right? The world is paying for its ruthless destruction.
Yes.
And when you think about that, American consumers and companies are paying, not the world.
Yes.
Your own people pay tariffs. The world doesn't pay tariffs.
Yes.
We're right back to that confusion now.
Yeah, like
right?
who pays for the tariffs?
Now here we are back to, foreigners are paying tariffs. Foreigners don't pay tariffs.
Foreigners do not pay
Right?
tariffs.
The world was not paying for its ruthless destruction. Our consumers, our companies were paying for Europe's ruthless destruction of the world or whatever. It doesn't make sense, right? But
and in turn,
there's the mentality again.
Potentially higher prices because there's less competition at a time when credit and the money supply is seizing up because banks are failing and people are skittish about the world economy. So
let me interject one quick thing. The stock market crash, 1929.
Yes.
October 20. You said 28.
Sorry.
Just stitching two things together. In the aftermath of that, in the beginning of the Great Depression, as was similar to the Panic of 1873, the government was not bailing any banks out.
It wasn't, and there were nobody wanted to put any restrictions on the banks either. Which is interesting, because once we did pass Glass-Steagall under Roosevelt, we did not. We kind of broke this cycle, this 20-year cycle that happened every 20 years. We would have an economic meltdown in this country beginning in 1937. I mean, it's not exactly 20 years, but it kind of is around that. 2019, we might do a program on this at some point. But there was no effort made to do anything about this. Hoover created something called the Reconstruction Finance Company, which was supposed to provide loans to businesses as a way of dealing with a credit crunch. But it wasn't nearly enough because you still got people whose businesses have ceased to exist. What do you do about them? If they're veterans, they get shot by Douglas MacArthur and his troops. There is no approach to actually address the consequences of the Great Depression, the consequences of this financial meltdown that occur.
You described it in the first episode after the Panic of 1873 as a laissez-faire government approach,
yes.
which it was again.
Yes.
Well, and I think, again, the context here is important, right? We since the New Deal, Americans have taken for granted until recently that the government does a lot of things to manage the economy, to look out for the welfare of people, et cetera, all those kind of things that we've gotten used to the government doing. But before FDR came into office, that was not considered in the United States. It was not considered the role of the government to help you, to look out for you. Until the New Deal, you could starve to death in the street. Taking care of you was up to your family, your church, charities.
Yeah.
There was no government program to look after you at all. And Marshall alluded to the bonus army coming to Washington, which I don't know if we're going to get into later or not. But, we did, famously after World War II, right, we had the GI Bill and everything. You could get taken care of for education and things like that, right, for having served your country. We did nothing for World War I veterans. They were due a bonus in 1948 because it was like 30 years after the war.
Yes, 30 years after.
When the Depression came along, they said, well, we kind of need the money now. We can't wait till 1948. They went and they camped out in Washington, and Douglas MacArthur led the army in there and shot at them and burned down their little village.
Tanks.
They used tanks. Because the government's job was not to look out for you. That was your problem in this country, right, at that time. And all through U.S. history up until that time.
Well,
Correct.
like
Bismarck famously, right, in Germany in like the 1880s had something equivalent to a social security system. We did not for another 50 years.
Yeah.
Bismarck, 1880s, and then there were similar social welfare systems that the British and the French had provided. We did not. I mean,
And Bismarck was no socialist.
no.
For those who don't know, he was a
Bismarck,
conservative European, Central European nationalist and all that.
a Junker.
A Junker, right? So, yeah.
Old German nobility, but Bismarck basically viewed this as stealing the thunder from the socialists, who were an important party in Germany at the time. We may want to return to this theme as we move on, but the way poverty and the way illness, even, and this is within our lifetimes, the way poverty was viewed was that people were not leading the right sort of life. You were poor because you deserved it. It was not because there were factors beyond your control, which this may be the case that if we're going back to the whole yeoman farmer aspect of things, yes, if you're not growing corn or whatever, tobacco, and you're not doing a good job, that might be because of your own lack of initiative. But when you're dealing with an industrial economy where you don't know your employer and you're working for organizations that number in the thousands, and then all of a sudden the gates are shuttered and you don't have work anymore, that's not really your fault. If you're doing your job, it's not like, you took too many sick days and therefore the company collapsed. The same is true of illness. I mean, illness was seen like that was a sign of your character and your lack of character. And that was the mentality that persisted up until the New Deal. We might want to move on here. So by 1932, the Republicans had so bungled addressing the economic problems of the Great Depression, they would lose their national dominance, a position they had had since McKinley's election in 1894 until 1980. The Democrats would, one way or the other, either politically or ideologically dominate things up until Reagan's election. So what we get with Roosevelt is we get an approach to dealing with these problems that are being addressed here. There is a lot of emphasis on planning that's going to be not only employed but also trumpeted by proponents of the New Deal. And just to think about this, why is this change of heart happening? Well, there is a lot of political and economic stress that's coming about, particularly in the year 1932, which is the worst year of the Great Depression. And there is very much a fear that there is going to be a revolution. And I'm going to argue that the United States, people might wish to disagree on this. The United States historically is not a compassionate society. It is because people are afraid that they're going to get their necks slit in their houses by angry, unemployed people that we start seeing attempts to mitigate things. There's fear by the haves against an increasing number of have-nots who are starving to death. And it was not much of a thought experiment to imagine, say, the consequences of, say, the French Revolution happening in the United States. And generally, this was communism spreading. There was
I was going to say, or the Russian Revolution happening,
or
in the United States.
or the Russian Revolution.
Or
I mean,
immediately at that time.
yes, because not the Communist Party had a lot of influence, but it's like there's a lot of spontaneous events that are happening, particularly over in the rural side, where people are trying to like take over farms that have been repossessed by the banks.
Well, and you add on top of that the Dust Bowl.
Yes, the Dust Bowl too.
1930 to 1937.
The Joad
out west.
family.
Yeah.
Going.
That was very real. And those people had no help from anywhere.
You know,
and if they couldn't grow it, they starved.
Yeah.
It was that simple.
You had to go out to California, put grandma on the truck, etc. You know, it's kind of interesting, just from where we sit now, that The Grapes of Wrath, which is the book about the Dust Bowl, it's still being banned because people find the kind of message about dealing with people who are facing these kinds of odds disturbing to their worldview.
And you know, as the novel shows you, the Okies showing up in California were very much looked down upon.
Yeah.
They were very much considered the wrong element.
Yes.
Right, to have here, right? For no other reason other than they were facing hard times. They were poor.
Yeah.
We don't want those people around here. We certainly don't want to help them.
Yeah.
Was the thinking of the time.
And they spoke funny.
Well, yeah, and then they sound different, all those other kind of things that kick in, right? So, yeah, it's an interesting point to consider, again, in the context of today. You know, here we are again. But anyway,
here we are again. Yes.
Moving on.
So what we see happening as a consequence of Roosevelt and his administration coming in and actually attempting to solve the problems of the Depression in an active sort of way meant the emergence of what later became known as the Roosevelt Coalition. Now, this put them in a dominant position politically, but it did not mean, you know, just because there are liberal elements within this, that the sorts of anti-immigrant, isolationist, and racist political rhetoric was eliminated. In many cases, these became sharper around the country as people were becoming concerned about the direction society was moving. One good example of this, and so back when Obama was president, we had Trump going around and talking about Obama not being a citizen of the country and therefore not entitled to be president. Okay, so Obama's mother her family came over on the Mayflower. Obama's family has actually been in this country much longer than Trump. If anybody is not entitled to be considered a citizen, it would be Trump, whose mother came over illegally from Scotland. Okay, so we had something comparable to this during Roosevelt's presidency. Now, Roosevelt also, Mayflower descendant, Mayflower ancestry, coming over. So not unlike the so-called birther movement fostered by Trump during Obama's presidency, a similar talking point that was advanced throughout FDR's presidency was that FDR was a secret Jew.
What the hell does that mean?
Well, at the time, this makes no sense, but at the time, the way people justified anti-Semitism is that Jewish people could not be Americans. They were part of a tribe. And this tribe had its own rules, its own regulations. For example, when Felix Frankfurter, who was appointed to the Supreme Court, was going through his confirmation process. Felix Frankfurter was Jewish. He was from Austria. And he was asked, can you be an American even though you're a Jew? And, I mean, just imagine that this is being asked by a member of the Senate, and this is considered to be an appropriate question to be asking. So, in the case of both Obama and Roosevelt, both charges are ridiculous. First of all, Obama's family on his mother's side goes back to Plymouth Rock. So you're about as American as you can get, and Obama's family has been in this country longer than Trump's has. And Obama's mother is not an illegal immigrant, unlike Trump's mother. So if we're going to start striking people from the citizenship ranks, we know where we can start here. Roosevelt's family is a mixture of Old Dutch, meaning that they were part of New York before New York was part of the colonies, not just the United States. And then on his mother's side, the Delano family, they go back to Plymouth Rock. They're also French Huguenots who came over here in the 17th century. And Roosevelt supposedly is related to a large number of U.S. presidents, to include people like John and John Quincy Adams, through various intermarriages. At the time, bear in mind, if you're respectable, there's only so many respectable people that you can marry. And just so some of those people happen to be presidential timber.
What were he and Teddy Roosevelt to each other? I forget.
They were fifth cousins.
Fifth cousins, yeah, okay.
Or fifth or fourth cousins, because Eleanor was his fifth cousin, okay?
Right.
And she was the daughter of Teddy's brother, Elliot. So they were related to each other, but, you know, in the manner of the time, people that were related that far apart still stayed in touch with each other because nobody went anywhere. And there was a lot of intermarriage that happened, too, as a result.
Bit like European royalty.
Yeah, and that was the model that they conducted themselves as. You know, these old families who lived along the Hudson.
But getting back to this stupid, you know, secret Jew thing that they were saying. So, I mean, the idea is, going back to what we've talked about, right?
Yeah.
The idea here is that to try to do things to take care of your fellow citizens is somehow communistic and socialistic, therefore somehow foreign.
And anti-Christian.
Anti-Christian, un-American.
Yeah.
Then you get, and I've never understood this, people can educate me on why it exists, but this association of Judaism with communism that keeps coming up in these kind of circles. I've never understood that, but I mean, there that is too. So you're taking a whole bunch of boogeymen, right?
Yeah.
And putting them together, xenophobic things, right? To then make FDR seem un-American and you know, doing strange foreign things that we don't want in this country, right?
Yes.
That's what this all comes down to.
Yes.
It's got nothing to do with who he was actually related to or what his actual family history is.
No.
It doesn't matter as long as you can call him a name that raises these boogeyman fears in people.
Yes. It's basically like using tropes, which, again, you know, we're seeing some of these tropes reemerge, and people who are unaware of the history, to get onto the mission of the podcast, where we're talking about, let's look at what people have forgotten about. You know, if you know the history, some of the things that you see in terms of opposition talking points, these things are old as Methuselah, you know, and so you keep seeing these things getting recycled. They wait for people to forget about them, and then they get reused again and repurposed in different guises.
But also, you see that the cartoon version, the bumper sticker version of American history that kind of looks at, well, Roosevelt came along and he did things to fix the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Right? There's issues with that because a lot of things he did during the Depression made it worse, and then finally he figured out how to make it better and that kind of thing, right?
Well, we didn't know economics like we now.
Then, right? So I'm not trying to blame him. I'm just saying that, right, he not everything he did was perfect. But the other point is that the things he did were not necessarily popular in a lot of circles.
Particularly,
there was a lot of resentment that lasted until
Trump.
Until today.
Until today.
But like you're saying, you were talking about in the 50s, right? Certainly in the 50s, it was very in very close memory, like 20 years ago, Roosevelt had done these things. And it was by no means accepted in many circles in the 50s, certainly.
The government is the
today.
enemy.
Yeah.
I mean, starting with Eisenhower. The opponents of the Great Depression thought he was going to dismantle everything.
I don't know what your grandparents did, but my grandparents were anti-Roosevelt. I heard all sorts of like nasty stories about this. Of course, now what this did was make me want to read up on Roosevelt, and I came to totally opposite conclusion as a result of all of this. But this is like in the late 60s, early 70s that I'm still hearing this. And we're talking about someone who died in 1945. So there is a lasting sense not only of positive things, but also of real visceral hatred concerning certain programs that were adapted there. And I think we're going to get into, some of the programs that actually worked and some of them that didn't. But to move on to talk about the Depression, so there were two things that kind of bit the dust that were associated with America First in the 1920s at this point. The first of these was Prohibition. Now, let's think about this. Here we have an industry and a market that is there, and there's nothing you can do to eliminate it. No matter how many laws you pass, it's still going to be there, this demand for alcohol. We are having the economy seize up. So what makes sense? Should we suppress an industry that people are willing to spend money on and promote? Or do we allow it to flourish? Well, under Roosevelt, and this was actually a talking point at the 1932 convention, Roosevelt basically said that we were going to get rid of Prohibition once and for all. Now, this was a strong talking point for people who were proponents of America First, the great experiment, which failed miserably in this country. We went from saloons that were populated by men to speakeasies that were populated by both sexes. So if anything, alcohol consumption increased as a result of banning it.
So you're bringing up the moral side of Prohibition.
Yeah.
You're bringing up the economic issue of Prohibition. Yeah. I mean, how did crime? Obviously, there was crime because of Prohibition. How did the crime situation factor into all this debate?
Well, because the only people that were really willing to, and this is just a logical conundrum. The only people who are supplying liquor at the time are criminals, because you're violating the law. And organized crime is the group that's most well equipped to be able to supply this forbidden fruit to people.
Right. Understood. But what I'm asking, though, is so in this debate, this political debate, circa 1932, economic, moral, but then also the crime issue was in there, too, is what I'm saying, right? What did they say about that on the two sides?
Well,
did they both agree that the crime was bad, or was there actually
people had come to the
debate over this, or what they?
I think the economic, anything to get the economy started, anything to stimulate the economy was considered good, just considering the fact just how bad things were. You're talking about the economy decreasing by about a third roughly by 1932, and so anything that would help with that. There was still strong moral grounds for people arguing against it, but the fact that we had seen all these cases of wealthy bootleggers and crime actually becoming more prominent as a result of Prohibition, it kind of trumped that. It kind of eliminated that. So
eliminated what? The moral?
It undermined the moral argument.
Right.
I would say
keeping people from drinking, but now you're rewarding organized crime. So
yes,
you're not getting ahead morally here, really.
And you're not really keeping people from drinking.
You're not really keeping people from drinking either.
If anything, as you and I have remarked previously, Mike, by making liquor illegal, you kind of lost control over it. You had no way. If it's illegal and it becomes part of this sort of underground economy, then people will drink, and you can have 11-year-olds go down and buy a bottle of vodka from their.
You can't license it. You can't tax it.
Yeah.
You can't regulate it.
You have no regulations.
By definition, because you don't have any official presence in it because it's illegal.
It's illegal, and so the market that's basically serving this, the best thing you can do if you have something that's a societal problem like alcohol is to regulate it, not to make it illegal, because then you lose all sorts of any ability to kind of control it as a result.
But I think I said this earlier, even de Tocqueville talked about how we were a really drunk country by European standards, and he was writing in the early 1800s about what he found here. We drank all day, everybody was drunk all day and such. So there was that. I'm not trying to defend prohibitionists, but they did have a reason beyond just morals and like that. Actually, socially, it was terrible because there were so many There was family violence. There was fathers abandoning families. There were drunks laying in the gut. It was happening all the time in the United States. So we were very drunk.
Yeah.
Prohibition then failed to really do anything about it.
Yeah.
Really, it did nothing successful. But
you're not if you're going to talk about that, you're not really treating the problem by making it harder to get. Right. You have to treat the individual. Right. But
and in fact, and this is prohibition is not our main topic, but one of the weird things about prohibition is that it was not actually illegal to possess alcohol.
No.
It was illegal to make it. It was illegal to ship it. It was illegal to sell it. But if you possessed it, that was legal.
Yeah.
So whatever you had in your house when prohibition started, they couldn't come take it from you because there's nothing wrong with having that.
Some of the senior men's clubs in New York, like the Union Club, stocked up big and basically managed to get through all of Prohibition with large supplies of liquor and wine intact. So if you were upper class, you go to the Union Club and get yourself a Manhattan, and nobody was going to come in there and raid the place.
There's the movie trope of the revenuers come in, right, and they're busting the speakeasies, something. Everybody's running out, jumping out the windows and things, right, to get away. But my understanding was that actually the patrons were not in trouble.
It was the owners.
They were merely possessing alcohol, and you could do that. It was the bartenders, it was the waitresses and waiters, it was the owner, it was whoever sold them this. Yeah, they were all in trouble. Not the people sitting there with the
Demi-tass.
The demi-tass.
Yeah.
We digress. It's interesting to consider how, if America First has this this concept of morality about it, there's a better and more
for
moral
immigrants.
Time. Well, but in this case for everybody.
Yeah.
It's interesting to consider how much of a failure Prohibition was in that sense.
Well, and also the fact that it was portrayed as like an immigrant, a problem that was being sponsored by immigrants, like the Irish going to the saloon or
the Italian gangs and
or having wine and stuff. But just the act of these ethnic groups, Italian, Germans with the beer halls and everything, which was quite a huge part of socialization for the ethnic German community.
Right.
It's like these things were seen as a way of white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism kind of controlling these guys. But it was a problem for native, like white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. It wasn't like they weren't drinking. They were drinking too, because you had the case with de Tocqueville before you had these big waves of immigration of alcoholism being rampant in the United States.
And it also wasn't just foreign people or
exactly
not true Americans engaging in this, right?
Yes.
You famously had Italian organized crime. You had Jewish gangsters. But you also had German gangsters who were much more accepted by this time in American polity, people of German ancestry, right? And of course, there were Irish gangsters, another ethnic group closer to the mainstream by the 1920s. You had plenty of people that had nothing to do with any of those ethnic groups who were drinking, involved in it somehow, right? It's another silly red herring to blame anything on some kind of foreign influence.
There are people in the Midwest, and the bootleggers are all like, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants that are running. Yeah.
But de Tocqueville was talking about the cities. He wasn't visiting the yeoman farmers who were in their backbreaking work day to day in the 1820s, right?
But in the 1820s, you couldn't drink the water. It would make you sick. What was safe? No, seriously, what was safe to drink?
Beer.
Booze was safe to drink.
Yeah.
Beer.
Was safe. Yeah. John Adams would get up every morning and he would have hard cider as a bracer. And it's like...
It's great for the digestion.
It's great for the digestion. He swore by it, and he lived to be in his 90s. But the reason he's drinking cider is not because he's a booze hound. It's because the water's not fit to drink. And they don't quite understand this whole bacteria thing and how you basically make water fit to drink at this point. So alcohol was ever present, but it was, like you said, there was a reason for this.
But the interesting thing about it, from the American First perspective, then, is that what you were saying about they're blaming somehow our problems with alcohol on a foreign influence.
Yes,
and it isn't.
It isn't.
Sure, foreigners came here and drank. We all did too.
Yeah.
That's so different. People drink, right?
Germans drank beer. We drank whiskey.
Drink whiskey. Yeah.
That was, that was actually the easiest way for people living in the interior to bring in crops, was to distill it rather than try. It's whiskey is lighter than say like bushels of grain here. We can refer to the Whiskey Rebellion, for example. So it's not something new here. So, but let's move on here and talk about the second element of America First. And this is kind of fun, in my mind, interesting. So the Klan gets a huge blow economically because of the Great Depression. The Klan had like a $10 annual membership fee. Because of the Great Depression, people weren't able to afford it. Too bad, as far as I'm concerned. But this kind of led them to kind of become economically bankrupt because they weren't getting in these membership fees that had kind of sustained them throughout the 1920s, allowed for this big march that we talked about in the previous episode about being able to march down Washington, D.C. That is being funneled and fueled by all manner of annual membership fees. People in rural America who are, again, having economic problems that are being made worse by the Great Depression, they cannot afford $10 to chip in to keep the Klan in business.
And $10 isn't selling much today, but that was some money back then.
It was. So, Mike, do you have any idea what $10 a year would be equivalent in purchasing power in 2025 money?
The internet tells me
Okay.
that $10 in 1932 is equivalent in purchasing power in 2025 of about $234.65. So we're talking 23 times plus as much. 23, 24 times as much.
And if you don't have any money to begin with, when you're basically having to make soup out of thistles, $10, that is what people are doing. People are making.
I wasn't expecting that.
It's true.
I believe you.
If you look at like social histories of like Studs Terkel book, which talks about the Great Depression, it's like things are pretty grim, and this is a luxury. A huge luxury.
We've heard the stories about people who would go into a restaurant, order a bowl of hot water, pour ketchup in it, and that was their tomato soup.
Yeah.
There were stories like that from the Depression. So.
Yeah, there's all sorts of things where, you use cornflakes to make, casseroles and stuff like that. Things that are going to be minimal costing ingredients they'll use to try to stretch
So
the ability to be able to feed the family.
So the country is much wealthier today than it was in the 1930s.
Yeah.
Even today, there are a lot of people who couldn't scrape together $235 for an annual fee for something.
Yeah.
Even today, right?
Yeah.
So, and this, there's a lot of money to those folks. So anyway.
Yeah.
So
and
that hurt the Klan.
That hurt the Depression hurt the Klan, and really, we're not going to see the Klan come back on the scene as a force until civil rights comes along in the 50s.
Now, it's the same. Remember, I was made the point in a previous episode, right, about how the Klan of the 1860s, 1870s was destroyed. The new Klan arose in the World War I, 1920s era. This is the same, that second Klan still existing, but it's at a much subdued level, right? It's not another new third Klan that's been created. It's the same. It's that same one, and it's managed to keep itself alive long enough and then to come back to prominence later.
Yes,
is that true?
But there are significant differences between this. I think we could call it the new Klan here.
In effect, it's a new movement.
It's not. It doesn't have the presence north of the Mason-Dixon line that the old one did. It's not like it doesn't exist, but
it has an organizational lineage, but it's a new movement within that.
And it's limited to the South, where because we're talking about civil rights here, and this is where the civil rights movement is actually operating.
So it lost its national prominence.
Yes.
The situation of the 20s where it was
you're not going to find
accepted and even honored
Yes.
throughout the country, that goes away because of its decline in the 30s.
Yes, and this is and I would argue this is kind of what makes it a pariah organization, where you do not have elements throughout the country supporting it, and it's limited to this regional area and so forth, that most of the country is going to find it distasteful.
Okay, it's fine to say that, but then why? So in other words, if it was fairly popular in the Midwest and the North in the 20s, then it goes broke. What makes those two don't have anything to do with each other, right? You could remain popular and be broke. You could be less popular and remain a wealthy organization. What is it that made them also less possible and less popular in addition to being more broke?
Well, other organizations come along, which we're going to get into.
We're going to get into that. Okay.
We're going to get into that somewhat.
I eagerly await.
Yes.
So, would it be fair to say that this second iteration of the Klan kind of reached its zenith at its march on Washington?
Yeah.
1925-ish?
Yeah.
Maybe, because the 1926 march that happened was only half the size.
Yeah.
And I would also just add as a side note that the 1910s and 20s coincide. That is exactly when this proliferation of monuments are erected to the Southern Confederate generals and icons, exactly in that time frame. That's it for this episode of the United States of Amnesia. Thank you for listening. We hope you learned something, and we hope you discovered new ways of looking at things you had already heard or thought about, or perhaps hadn't heard about. If you enjoyed it, that's great. If we made you mad, that's okay too. Either way, email us at usa.amnesia@gmail.com and let us know what you think. Also, let us know about anything you think we missed or got wrong. We'd like to know about that too. And of course, please like and subscribe and let your friends and neighbors know about us. We also have a website. It's www.usofamnesia.com. For Marshall, Mike, and myself, till next time.